Okay, folks, I think it's 6:05, and we'll get started. So this is the wooden galvanic action redux after had some technical difficulties last time, but we'll have a go at it again here now. I'm Ralph. I work with the Amber Book team. I have a background in several different things. My particular areas of expertise that have to do with what we'll be talking about tonight are I did forestry judging for several years up through high school and finished my time in that field at a competition where the team I was on placed third nationally, and I was personally in the top 10. So I know a little bit about trees, and that lends itself to work with the Amber Book in soils and siding and some landscaping aspects, and also how timber is specified and that sort of thing in structural applications. We're going to be talking in particular tonight about the implications that modern pressure treating chemicals have when we're building decks using metal fasteners in those decks. So we're going to go over what galvanic action is. We're going to go over how wood behaves, and really at a much more basic level, what is wood. We're going to go over what treated lumber actually is, and then what happens when galvanic action and treated lumber play together. So we have our question here. A yoga studio in a historic district in Savannah, Georgia wants to build an addition with a ground level deck. The historic district requires wood siding and wood decks, and all visible flashing must be metal. What is the best treated lumber fastener pair for the deck joists and their connections if the building's visible flashing is galvanized steel? And then we have a little axon here showing the ground level deck abutting the building, and with one of those connection pairs highlighted where the joists meet the footer. And so, make sure that I've got the right thing here. So the answer is UC4 CA treated Southern pine lumber with stainless steel hardware and fasteners. And tonight, this question is very much written to be much harder than what you'll ever see on the ARE. We're covering 1, 2, 3, 4 aspects of specifying treated lumber and fasteners in each of those answers. The treatment classification, what treatment chemical is being used, what wood species set is being used, and in none of those cases are Southern pine SPF, which is spruce pine fir, treated hem fir, which is hemlock Doug fir technically. And then again, Southern pine. In none of those cases are any of those actually referring to a specific tree species, but rather a group of species that are common in one part of the U.S. or another. But so think about it as practicing for a 5K by running a double marathon. We had a question, shouldn't galvanized flashing go with galvanized hardware? We'll go over that a little bit later, but if you look at the drawing, that's a red herring. So moving on, what is galvanic action? Galvanic action is where we have two dissimilar metals in direct contact with a large difference in what's called electrochemical potential, in the presence of a conductive electrolyte, which can be something as simple as just water. Any environment that the two metals are in that can facilitate electrons moving from the cathodic side to the anodic side, if I've got that right here. But anytime you have two dissimilar metals in direct contact with a large difference in electrochemical potential, you end up with one of those two metals corroding much faster than the other. And the anodic side specifically will corrode much faster than normal, while the cathodic side is actually protected. in that reaction will corrode slower than it otherwise would. So electron flow goes to the anodic side. Material flow, which is the positively charged ions, the nucleus of the metal atoms, flows toward the cathodic side. So if you have a galvanized, which is zinc coated steel product, for example, the zinc will be sent, the steel will be sending electrons to the zinc, and the zinc will be sending positively charged zinc ions to the steel, and material deposition happens. And so the question then is, what direction do electrons flow on this chart here? And what about corroded material? So we have here, which direction do the electrons flow, and which direction does the material flow? And if I can get out of the highlighter here, there we go. And so there we go. The electrons flow from the cathodic side to the anodic side, and the material flows, which again is the positively charged ions, flows from the anodic side to the cathodic side. So a follow-up question for answer choice number 2 here. What's wrong with the hardware that we have? So we have stainless steel hardware and we have galvanized fasteners. And the problem that you have there is that zinc is, in this case, because anytime you see galvanized, that means zinc. But zinc is more anodic than steel. And so what will tend to happen if you have stainless steel hardware, which is the large plate pieces, right, that connect the material, and galvanized fasteners, which are the little nails or screws or whatever you're using, is that the electrochemical potential is focused in. That's another aspect of galvanic action, is you'll have a difference in electrochemical potential between two metals. But if, for example, you have a large zinc sheet with a copper fastener in it, the zinc sheet will be corroded, but because there's relatively little copper providing electrochemical potential to move material, and a relatively large area of zinc to absorb that electrochemical potential, you actually end up in a relatively okay situation. So as we have down here at the top and bottom of this list, if a anodic metal, you're going to have problems if the fastener is on that side, and vice versa on the cathodic side. But anyway, so the problem with the stainless steel hardware and the galvanized fasteners here is that stainless steel and zinc have a relatively high electrochemical potential difference. And so the zinc fastener is going to rust out the zinc will corrode through, and then the steel fastener within the zinc will rust out way faster than it normally would. And so generally speaking, if at all possible, you want to keep your fastener and hardware pair, or fastener and sheet material pair, the same if possible. So again, here's an image of some hot dip galvanizing happening, where we have all of the pieces and we have a big vat of molten zinc, and you dip the pieces, but again, galvanized steel in the context of galvanic action is not steel, it's zinc. One other place where actually the discovery of galvanic action happened through a naval process, whereby in salt water there's a clam called the teredo worm that is devastating to any wood that's kept in the water, and that's one of the big reasons why old wooden shipwrecks in any of the oceans disintegrate just over a very short period of time. And why you'll see, like on the boat we have in the upper left-hand corner, you'll see a little bit of copper cladding on the rudder, and then This is an image of not the USS Constitution in Boston Harbor, but rather one of her sister ships of a similar vintage that's in Baltimore Harbor. But the green at the bottom there, at least historically, would have been copper cladding. I've not actually been able to get details enough to see if that actually is or not. But here's our shipworms, and an image of some of the damage that they can cause. And that pole may have been in the water for 2 or 3, maybe 4 years at the most. But in all saltwater, ships are eaten up very, very quickly, which is why one of the few ships that is of a vintage that can be actually seen still is the Vasa in Stockholm, which sunk in the early 1600s in the Baltic Sea, which is more or less fresh water. The Baltic is not salty enough to actually be dehydrating if you drink it. And so shipworms don't live in the water that's as brackish as, or not as slightly brackish as the Baltic Sea is. And so you have really good preservation of a lot of wooden things there. This is actually a photograph that I took a few years ago. This, I think, is the Constitution in Boston Harbor. But so in the 1600s, the Royal Navy used lead sheeting on their boats to keep the shipworms out. That was stripped off because they used iron bolts to hold the lead in place. And if you go back and look at our galvanic action chart here, it doesn't actually show it, but lead is slightly more noble than plain iron. And so you had a very large contributing area in a really good, saltwater is an extremely good electrolyte. And so the bolt heads rusted away just fairly quickly. And then they started cladding ships in copper in the 1760s. The very first copper clad ship that was done was HMS Alarm in 1761. It went on one trip. So after its maiden voyage, after returning to port, all of the iron nails that had held that copper sheeting in place were described as having been corroded to paste, again, because of galvanic action. And then Luigi Galvani and Alessandro Volta in the 1780s through about 1800 worked on figuring out the actual physics and chemistry involved. The Statue of Liberty is another famous case. The copper and steel fasteners there were actually because Gustav Eiffel knew about galvanic action. There was a paper, a like tar impregnated paper gasket, you could call it, between the steel fasteners and the copper. Those had disintegrated pretty much by the 1980s, which is why the Statue of Liberty saw a big facelift then. But here's a case where we have what's probably aluminum flashing and a steel bolt, and then there's a little washer or something under the steel screw. And that bright red rust that you're seeing there is indicative of galvanic action. And actually, I take that back. It's more likely, if you look at the chart here, that the little metal trim piece that's screwed into is stainless steel than plain steel. More recently, galvanic action is still a major problem for navies. This is the USS Independence, which was launched around 2011. It has an aluminum hull and it had stainless steel fixtures. A question for you all is, how long was it in service? The hint of that being that if it was launched in 2010 and it's not in service anymore, not very long. And the reason, one of the big reasons that it was withdrawn from service was they were having corrosion problems due to galvanic action between those stainless steel fixtures that penetrate the hull and the hull itself. That said, it's complicated. Here is a half-inch galvanized pipe. There's a roughly quarter-mile of pipe run at my parents' house between where the well is and where the house is. And that half-inch pipe was installed in 1947 and is largely still in service. Here's a section, though, that corroded out and had to be replaced recently. And if you'll see, you can actually see the hole in the pipe right there. But if you look, the inside of the pipe is almost not corroded at all. And you do have pretty large pockets of rust on the outside, but it's not such a problem as you might think it would be. The issue, though, there, the reason that it corroded through in the spot that it did, is this tile that you're seeing across the string with the section taken out was the gray water drain from the kitchen sink. And so the thing that caused that pipe to rust out was roughly 50 years of kitchen sink water, which has a lot of salt and soaps and is a really good electrolyte, leaking down where one of those two joints was loose. And the hole in the pipe was almost immediately, or almost directly on top of, or not on top, almost directly below where that misaligned joint was. So then we'll move on to what is lumber and what is treated lumber. Treated lumber has been around really for a really long time. If you go back to people who would extract pitch from pine species and other sources and coat wood in pitch, but we treat commonly used wood species that are not themselves inherently decay resistant, so that we can cheaply use lumber in all sorts of exposed rot or insect damage prone uses. There are 5 use classifications, from indoor dry use to marine. Pressure treated lumber comes in oil-borne treatment chemical varieties and waterborne treatment chemical varieties. Importantly, for the question that we had here, ground contact, which the deck was described as, is use class number 4. So that automatically ruled out C and D here, where UC1 and UC3 would not be sufficient for the deck being within the deck members being within 16 inches of the ground or so. So here, some species are inherently rot resistant, but they tend to be harder to get and more expensive than the species that we tend to use in light frame construction and decks and that sort of thing. Question, what UC4 is ground contact. So anywhere where the lumber is within, and they classify ground contact as anywhere where your wood is going to be within, I think it's 16 to 18 inches of the ground. The premise being that if it's that close to the ground, the earth tends to stay fairly damp. And most insects that we're trying to keep out by treating lumber and fungus and that sort of thing really like moisture. So you need better treatment to avoid the lumber decaying away than you do with indoor and other intermittently wet outdoor uses. But so here we have an image of, these are at least 50-year-old black locust fence posts. And then we have some eastern, probably not eastern, but cedar shakes on the side of this building. That fence post is in a location that stays fairly wet and is very much prone to termites. But there are certain species that are just extremely rot and decay resistant and will last for a very long time. The problem being that they're much more expensive, they're harder to work, et cetera, where we can get southern yellow pine or your spruce pine fir species, and we can grow them at a rate of something like an inch every 5 years or so, if not faster in some locations. And then it's structurally strong enough to be used, and et cetera, et cetera. Historically, pitch or resin was used to coat timbers to aid in their preservation. This is an outdoor museum in I think it's Oslo, where they have several really old log structures, and you can see the it's probably creosote treated in this case, but gives you a visual of what a pitch coated piece of wood would look like roughly. Following pitch, one of the first commonly used treatments at an industrial scale that came into being is creosote, which is one of the oil-borne ones. It came about because railroads used a ridiculously large amount of cross ties originally, and those cross ties tended to have a service life of at most about 5 years untreated. So you'd get your oak cross ties and you'd put them in, and then 5 years later you'd need to take them out and replace them. By treating lumber with creosote, they were able to use cheaper wood species and then also have the ties last 20, 30, maybe even 50 years in service, ground contact, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the reasons that we treat lumber is to take care of bugs. Another reason is to take care of fungus. Creosote is creosote. It should be spelled, yeah, creosote. And it was kind of the ubiquitous treatment up until roughly the 1930s, I think, when we started to develop other chemicals. But so we treat for bugs and then we treat for fungus, and sometimes the treatments are good for one and not the other. So one question is, what's the bug that's in the picture here? And then the other question is what's a wood destroying bug that we've already talked about? I'll let you think about that for just a little bit. Here's another image of termite damage. This is old growth oak cladding on the outside of a shed that was put in probably in the mid 1950s. And you can see where the termites have absolutely eaten up roughly the bottom 16 to 18 inches of the lumber where it stays moist from the ground. We were talking about ground contact being 16 inches from the ground or closer, and you can see that this is why that 16 inches was chosen. Similarly, UC5 is marine grade, which is explicitly targeting keeping shipworms out of the piles. And you use a lot more chemical than you would for even land uses because of how voracious shipworms are. I've actually read quite a bit. One concern that you might have is, well, what happens when these chemicals start to leach into the water? Around piles, you usually see oysters and other bivalves latching on, and those are typically really important ecosystems. The little bit of research that I've read on the subject suggests that old growth pine piles, the turpentine compounds that leach from those old growth pine compounds are actually more detrimental to the more of a growth inhibitor to these sensitive little ocean bugs than the chemical compounds that you'll see used in treatment. And in fact, there may be some reactions that occur with the treating compounds in salt water where the compounds are actually fixed a bit better than you might even think otherwise. But if you only need to treat for insects and you are using the lumber in a place that's going to be covered and protected from the ground, you can actually use boron or borax type treatments. That's the SBX/DOT that was listed in answer choice number 3. So one question for you is, in what country is this pink lumber we're seeing here commonly used? Yeah, we've got at least one right answer there already. The blue is also a borax treated lumber. The big thing is borax is water soluble, so if the wood gets wet, in the case of a building wall, that actually works pretty well because the borax tends to get pulled to where the water is, so it actually works better. But in a ground contact kind of situation where it just stays wet, the borax leaches out and then isn't useful anymore. We've had several different chemicals get phased out from different uses over the years. Here's a telephone pole that was probably put in 1976. That G76, the 76 refers to the year. This particular pole is treated with pentachlorophenol, which is the SPP code. It was actually just phased out this year. It was the common oil-based treatment compound used in telephone poles and electric poles, utility poles. It did account for 50% of utility poles, but was actually just phased out this year. They decided that it leaches out into the environment just a little bit too much for the residential areas that you often have utility poles used in. So there's a bit too much of a buildup of the chemical in the soils for people to be comfortable with. And again, this pole was installed in 1976, so you're looking at a 50+ year service life on a lot of these. We do have other treatment compounds though that are used still in utility poles. And really in pretty much all of the cases of the different treatment compounds that exist, you're balancing toxicity with use case with longevity. And so you'll use compounds that you might not want to use because of their toxicity in cases where humans are going to be regularly in close contact, especially young people are going to be regularly in close contact with them, where for something like a utility pole, where generally speaking, you're not going to have kids playing in the dirt around them over and over year after year. You might use a chemical that you wouldn't use for a residential deck, for example. And so here is a pole that is treated with CCA. That's the answer choice in number 2. The SPSK code on it gives that. This pole was probably, well, not installed, but made in 1991. And chromium copper arsenate, which is CCA, was phased out for residential use in 2003. And its phase out is actually the big reason that we're actually doing the Zoom call about the topic that we are doing now, because the chemicals that replace CCA, which are Ca and ACQ, which is alkaline copper quaternary, use a much higher percentage of copper and thus have a much higher galvanic potential than the old CCA treated lumber. So CCA is chromium copper arsenate, and its composition was about, I think, 30% chromium, which is not great for you, about 30% copper, and then something like 40% of the arsenic compounds. And we decided that it's just not something that we want to be using in. It's just not something we want to be using in an environment where humans are the same humans especially, are going to be coming into contact with it day after day, like on a deck or on children's playground equipment, et cetera, et cetera. But it was and is still used in more industrial applications like these utility poles, et cetera, et cetera. Michael and I actually went on a walk briefly around the office here, and in, I don't know, 15 minutes, we'd identified roughly 20 cases of pretty interesting galvanic action, often related to things nailed into these utility poles. So I'm going to throw a link in the chat if I can. Well, I said that I would. We'll get that to you one way or another here. There we go. So this document was actually put together by another professor of mine in the wood science department here at Virginia Tech. He was responsible for a major rewrite of the building code to do with residential decks. And the document that is linked there is the kind of prescriptive guide for residential decks now. And basically the research that they did suggested that the types of connections that were being used, were not structurally sufficient for what the building code was requiring, and so were prone to collapse. And then also B, when the changeover was made for residential treated lumber from the old CCA products to the modern alkaline copper quaternary, or CA, which is the whole family of copper azoles. But the galvanic action problems that those higher copper lumber, treated lumbers were causing, was resulting in service lives of like 5 years or less. And when they failed, the fastener failed rather than the lumber. So you go out on your deck, the deck would visually from the top look perfectly fine, but all of the connections on the underside would be completely rusted out. So that's a really good document if you're working on decks at all to know about and reference. But the industrial group for treated lumber is American Wood Protection Association. They have a fair number of decent white papers and reference materials on their website, which is awpa.com. The document that I've linked there, though, is from the American Wood Council, which is AWC, and they're an organization that is also an industry group that promotes the use of especially light framing types of lumber. But again, there's a fair number of useful white papers there. So here we have an image of a landscaping timber, and this was taken on that walk that I took with Michael just out back. Here we have an image of a pretty recent landscaping timber with what was galvanized bolt driven in there. The question is, what's going on there? And the answer, of course, is that because of the higher copper content in the modern treated lumber, like this landscaping timber, it actually eats away at the zinc galvanizing faster than it would have. And so now we're starting to get into why the answer to the question that was asked at the beginning is what it is as well. But in this case, the new treatment compounds are more corrosive because they have a higher copper content, so they've eaten away the zinc plating there a bit more than they would have otherwise. The nut and washer combination at the top here is another one where we have 304 stainless steel. That bolt is 304 stainless. And then we had a steel washer and what was probably an aluminum sign. And so you've had galvanic action between the stainless steel and the aluminum and the steel, which has resulted in that steel washer rusting away way faster than it should have otherwise. And basically the same thing is happening with the big plate washer at the bottom of the image as well. Jumping back to treated lumber briefly, for those of us on the East Coast, this image will look kind of weird, but for those of you who are out in Seattle and California, there are different wood species that grow in different parts of the US and are used in light frame construction. And when you treat those species, the actual wood itself behaves differently. So here we have a piece of hem fir, and this is probably Douglas fir, which is not a true fir. But most hem fir species, the wood cellular structure is such that after the tree is dead, the cells close up. And so to get the treatment compound in them, you actually have to incise them. So basically you'll have a bunch of rollers with what amount to razor blades on them, and you'll run the lumber through those razor blades, and that lets the treatment compound soak in. It does reduce the bearing capacity, though, of those timbers by something like 5 to 15%. And so that's something we as practitioners have to kind of have an awareness of, that you'll need, if you're using Western species of treated lumber, you'll end up often needing slightly larger timber sizes to carry the same loads. And again, that deck guide, here's an image of, so these timbers are, this is a good example of what that deck that we were talking about in the question might look like when constructed. Talking again about what ground contact lumber is. And the big thing is you end up treating, we do use pressure treated wood on the East Coast. However, the East Coast species, the physical properties of the wood cells behave differently after the tree is felled. And so you can treat the lumber without having to incise it for Eastern species. And you can always look at, you'll see treated lumber will always have some sort of a tint to it compared to untreated lumber, whether it's green or it looks like with the oil-borne compounds, you'll often see those oil-borne compounds seeping out, et cetera. But ground contact lumber is treated, I want to say, and I've got the reference here somewhere, but it's something like 30% more chemical. And it's treated in, I think, pounds per cubic foot of lumber, pounds of treatment compound retained per cubic foot of lumber. But anyway, and so just going through our other three answers here, the answer is A. The answer is not B, because CCA is not an appropriate treatment for CCA is not an appropriate treatment for these kinds of high contact uses like you would see on a yoga studio deck. It's also not the correct answer because spruce pine fir SPF lumbers are not treatable rather to UC4. They are softwood species that are more rot prone. And so to reach a UC4 treatment classification, you need enough treatment compound in a wood species that is inherently not extremely rot prone in the way that spruce pine fir is. And then of course the stainless steel hardware and galvanized fasteners doesn't work either. C is not the answer because UC1 is indoor treatment, and SPX DOT is the borax treatment compounds that are not suitable at all for outdoor use because they're completely water soluble. Hem fir would have been fine. And G185, the other thing, going back to that image of the landscaping timber with the bolt in it, that bolt was probably treated to the old galvanizing standard, the pre-CCA changeover galvanizing standard, which is G60. And I think that refers to some thickness of galvanizing. I don't know the unit, unfortunately, but the modern standard is G185. So that's roughly triple what the old standard was. So the fastener and hardware combination here would be okay. That said, the things that I've read more recently suggest that it's better to have your hardware and fasteners be stainless steel rather than even the heavy galvanizing, because eventually the zinc will corrode away and then you'll be left with uncoated steel, and then that will rust out fairly quickly. The last one is not the answer because UC3 is not ground contact. and the hardware and fasteners are insufficient. But I will now turn it over to Megan to handle taking questions. Just a few questions that are in the chat here briefly. Anodic metals, not only will anodic metals always rust faster than cathodic metals, but the anodic metal rusting, it's corroding really because rust is steel or iron. The anodic metals decaying away are protecting the cathodic metals from rusting. So no, cathodic metals won't, they're the protected element of the pair.
All right, I'll just pop in here to say you can go ahead and raise your hand if you have a question, and I will ask you to unmute.
One more question that's in the chat here. The fourth answer choice is not correct because UC3 is not ground contact grade of treatment. ACQ can be treated, you can use ACQ to treat to UC4, which is ground contact. But in this case, that particular answer choice specifies UC3, which is not ground contact. And then G60 is not sufficient galvanizing for modern treated lumber. And then turning back over to Megan there to actually moderate some questions for us.
Hi.
Yep.
Hi, this is Frederick. How are you?
Hi.
Hi, I have a question. I am the one who asked the question about the last, the answer was not the G60. I just still don't get it. I just don't get it.
So when the changeover was made from the chromium copper arsenate to the alkaline copper quaternary and copper azole, the amount of copper per unit of treating compound like tripled or quadrupled. And so zinc, the way that zinc protects steel in galvanized hardware is the zinc oxidizes, which is the zinc equivalent of rusting. Zinc oxide tends to be fairly durable though, so unless it's abraded away, the zinc will oxidize and then that layer will protect the zinc from oxidizing away further in theory. Modern treated lumber with the two modern treatment compounds has such a high galvanic potential on the cathode side. So it's putting such a high electrical load on the zinc that G60, which is like a third as thick of galvanizing as the G185 that's required for modern use, or for that is currently required.
Okay,
is not enough to handle that higher electrical load.
That's right.
So
the 85.
Yeah, so the G60, that zinc is so thin that it gets stripped away by the really high electrical load, and then the steel rusts. So you have to use thicker galvanizing.
Right, because in practice, it's the 85 that is used with pressure treated.
Yes, with modern pressure treated in residential applications, especially.
Okay, I forgot that.
Yep.
I forgot that. Okay, so it's not wrong to have galvanized with galvanized fasteners with pressure treated. Okay, and another question I had was I heard about MCQ as a new pressure treated versus ACQ. Can you explain a little more about MCQ?
So I did. So as a caveat, I did most of the recent research that I've done for this presentation like 3 weeks ago, and I definitely read a bit about, and I think is it MCQ or MCA, micronized copper azole.
Maybe MCA. I forgot.
Yeah, there are additional treatment compounds that have been developed recently in the context of the ARE. Knowing the abbreviations of the most common ones are really where you're at. Like I prefaced this whole discussion with, we're running like a double marathon to prepare for something like a 5K.
Okay.
In terms of how involved the way that I wrote that question was.
So should we should we remember now that it's MCA or MCQ, or we're just staying at for the purpose of the exam?
The big thing is I would understand for the exam that CC, because the exam is it's mostly multiple choice and other sorts of questions where you can use process of elimination. So the big thing is to know that CCA is not appropriate for residential uses anymore.
No.
Rather than know quite so much that CA or ACQ specifically are appropriate, right?
Right.
Or the other options, and I kind of doubt, because of how common CA and ACQ still are. I doubt that you're going to see the plethora of less common but also approved treatment options show up.
Yeah, so the newest probably won't be there. The MCQ or the MCA. I'm seeing online that there are two. Apparently, two of them are correct. MCQ/MCA. So, okay. So the ACQ is still used anyway. It's right.
ACQ is totally appropriate. Is considered totally appropriate for residential uses. It's one of the two high copper. And the big thing is that neither of those use arsenic or chromium in them. The reason that we phased out the old treatments for residential uses were they contained quite a lot of arsenic, which is not something that we want to be exposing ourselves to. And they contain quite a lot of chromium, which is something else that we don't really want to be exposing ourselves to a lot of.
Okay. And so for a new project now, should we say ACQ or MCQ?
It depends entirely on local availability and the specific needs of that project. But the big thing is just which of those is going to be the most economical to meet the specific needs of the project that you have. Same thing with copper azole and ACQ. There's no, the code doesn't really differentiate in terms of use case for those two.
Okay. Another last question I have is, can you again give an idea of how to conceptually pick the right metal that goes with the other? Which way should we think the electrolyzer is going? Is it going to the cathode or the anode?
So just to back up to somewhere where I have a good image of that little graphic that I made.
I could say,
so again, electrons, which is not really the problem. The problem is the material flow, but electrons flow from the cathodic side, which is negatively charged, to the anodic side, which then results in the anodic side kicking off positively charged ions, which is the nucleus of the atom. It's where most of the atomic mass is, toward the cathodic side, which then eats away at the anodic side. On the very upper end, and this is an extremely reduced, super general galvanic series that I've given here that only lists common architectural metals. But like at the very top end of the cathodic series, you'd see gold, platinum, that sort of thing. You can almost think about how those metals kind of feel, or their fineness, right? Stainless steel is a super polished, never corrodes sort of thing. Copper will corrode, but tends to not corrode very quickly, and the corrosion will stay. And then on down where like if you've ever handled galvanized hardware that's been out in the elements, like the zinc oxide is an extremely hydrophilic substance, so it likes to soak up water. And so I just moved 50 galvanized steel like crowd control panels this past weekend. And after doing that, my hands were so dry because of all of the zinc oxide that I'd handled that then got on my hands. But almost just keeping a thought about what the texture of the metal is after it's been outside for a little bit will give you some hints. and how durable the corrosion compounds that those metals make are. Right, so magnesium oxide is super powdery, zinc oxide is super powdery, aluminum oxide is super powdery. Rust is still pretty powdery, but you can leave steel outside for quite a while, right, before it really has a problem. Copper, the oxide that copper makes is quite durable, and then of course stainless steel rarely makes much of an oxide at all. But who else has a question? Anybody? I see one in the chat about passive steel and active steel. I don't know the specific metallurgical differences between the two, but passive steel is going to be toward the more cathodic side. So it's going to be less prone to kicking off positively charged ions. Whereas active steel will tend to have a bit more of a positive charge, and so will be a little bit more prone to ending up on the anodic side of a galvanic pair. Matthew?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, I just want to make sure I understood what you just mentioned. So, so if you pick like a stainless steel screw with like maybe like aluminum hardware, then you will rust, right? Like
aluminum sheet,
yeah,
for example. So you're probably going to be okay in that case. Generally speaking, if at all possible, it's best to match the material that you're using for your plate, your sheet material, and what the fastener is, or to have the two the closer together metals are in the galvanic series, the less likely you are to have problems as well. But if you're using a stainless steel screw in an aluminum sheet, you've got a relatively small amount of electron potential flow, right? Because the stainless steel screw is a very small surface area being distributed over a very large surface area in the aluminum plate. Eventually, the aluminum plate will show corrosion, galvanic corrosion, but because it's a pretty large surface area, you're less likely to have problems. Pablo?
Hello, how you doing?
Hi, good.
Just had a quick question. I might be breaking it down too basic, but is there such a thing as saying, just breaking it down, that the anodic versus the cathodic, which is the bad guy, basically? I mean, is it that simple, or?
I mean, in terms of like
corrosion,
the side of the pair that you're going to have, if there are problems, you will always have problems with the anodic side of the pair.
Okay.
Because that's the side that will always be where corrosion is happening.
Got it. That clears it up. Thank you.
Yep, welcome. And just briefly, Joy, on the sign example, a big thing is to just always match your metal pairs. So if they had used a stainless steel washer that matched that Series 304 stainless screw, they probably would have been fine. If lumber's not treated, then none of this really applies, because the treatment compound is where you're getting galvanic action from, not the wood itself. But thanks, everybody, and we'll have another session at 6 this coming Thursday. And I don't actually know who offhand will be presenting it. The question that was at the end of my presentation was for the week following the week that this was originally scheduled for. But if you'll keep an eye on your emails and on our Instagram page, you'll see what next week's question will be posted soon. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Ralph.